Beautiful things indeed. Thank you. So I have a story to start us off today. And it's got all the trappings of the setup for a really good joke, but without the punchline, so bear with me. So a Jesuit, a Lutheran, and a Unitarian walk into a bar. See, during my time working as a chaplain at UC Davis Medical Center, I went out for drinks with some colleagues. And a colleague and friend, James, who's a Jesuit novice, he asked me a question about a quote from Martin Luther about sinning boldly. So the exact quote was, "Be sinners and sin boldly," which was from a letter from Luther to his friend and co-reformer Melanchthon while Luther was in hiding. And my friend James asked me this very good and very Lutheran question of, what does this mean? And so as we sat together with our friends and explored this question, we were naturally drawn to these verses here in Galatians to imagine the radical freedom that we have through God's grace. What we can do when we're freed from having to think too closely about following the rules, and how that can free us up to follow Christ more faithfully. So through this conversation, we shared places where being open with our mistakes and vulnerably taking risks has been key to learning and growing in our lives and in our ministries. When taking risks and letting ourselves be fully seen just as we are helped to unlock something in those around us who watched this living freely and found a way to free themselves too. Now, one example that we talked about while we were talking together, and that often comes to mind for me when I think about sinning boldly, is in choral music. But I think any musical ensemble probably could work for it. The idea here is if you're in rehearsal, you want to make your mistakes really loudly so you can be corrected. So you full-throatedly can be a part of the whole song. And the music can be made better by your participation in it, rather than being afraid of making a wrong note and sort of muffling the noise. This risk-taking, this openness to sinning boldly, it demonstrates the kind of freedom that Paul's pointing us to in this chapter. So to help orient us into this kind of freedom, not just in an academic or an intellectual kind of way, but connecting to the totality of our experience, I want to ask you some questions. Starting with, what does freedom feel like for you? To get our heads here, we might think of a time or a place where we have felt totally free. Now, for some of us, that will be easier than for others. For some of us, it's hard to access. We can't really quite get there thinking what it would be like to be free, to be unbound. And if that's you in this moment, I imagine you just to invite to imagine what freedom might feel like, even if the experience hasn't quite landed on you yet. So what happens in your body when you're totally free? What thoughts come to your mind? And what's God's presence doing in your midst when you're totally free? Now, there are so many different ways of experiencing freedom. Our bodies might notice sort of a lack of feeling weighed down, this incredible lightness in our being. Or you may feel more grounded, more fully rooted to the earth, stable, and unlikely to sway one way or the other. In our thoughts, our minds can be filled with possibilities when we're free. We can be brimming with ideas of what we can think and do and be. Or, conversely, our minds might be cool and smooth like a pond, calm, nearly Zen-like in their ability to notice and wonder about the world around them. There are other ways of experiencing, too, that I've noticed recently. So my oldest nephew just passed his driver's test, and he has his driver's license now. And watching him as he borrows the car has reminded me of the joy and the delicious freedom that came with learning how to drive. Suddenly, it feels like the whole world is available, not just as far as your legs can carry you. There's adventure around every corner. With the windows down and the music up, freedom can whip your hair back and fill up your lungs as you sing along. Now, your times of freedoms might look different. Maybe they're mountaintop experiences, or maybe they come as your feet hit the pavement as you walk through the world. Maybe it's in letting go of old expectations, or maybe it's in finding people who really understand you and see you. One beautiful thing about freedom is that it can be so varied as the individuals in this room. And yet, even as I'm talking about the beauty of freedom, I expect that for some of us in this room, you're tensing up. That this tension and constriction, it can feel like a tightness that keeps us hemmed in and gets in the way of living into the freedom that God's grace provides. So I ask you now, what does this tightness, what does this control feel like? And once again, to get into the headspace, think of a time where you felt completely stuck, unable to make a move one way or the other, or when you've been constrained and weighed down by the expectations, either yours or those imposed on you by other people. What happens in your body when you're feeling controlled? What kind of thoughts come into your mind? And how easy is it to access God's presence when you're in this headspace? This tightness of control and adherence to the rules was cultivated for a reason. Oftentimes, this pattern comes with the expectation of safety. We pass it down like a rite of passage and a precious heirloom bestowed from generation to generation. Being in a place of control and tight restriction and watching a person who is radically free is terrifying. The anxiety tapes start to play, and fear for and judgment of the person blares like sirens going off. And I wonder if that's part of why we attempt to control and critique the behaviors of those around us. And in doing so, we enforce rules that harm, that we don't even fully believe, and pass them down, saying, don't talk too much, but don't be too quiet. Don't wear that. Don't brag. Now, don't talk to strangers, but don't be rude. Don't be too excited or too silly or too much. Just don't. It's dizzying and it's exhausting. These rules come from a place of control, but they also come from concern. They come from seeing consequences of not following these rules and maybe not wanting the other person to bear the consequences. Now, there also may be some attachment to these rules and fear that the whole thing will topple over, the whole system will be destroyed if we step over a line. And we find ourselves more committed to the rules and the system than to the people we think we're protecting. We see the potential vulnerability of this freedom and the hurt that might occur, so we bind and we squash our children's expressions of freedom, our partners' expressions of freedom, our parents' expressions of freedom, and our friends' expressions of freedom, so that they won't be hurt and we won't be embarrassed. In Paul's context, writing to the church in Galatia, it's possible that some of these same motivations were at play for this community as they struggled to learn what it means to follow Jesus. Now, some folks had followed these laws and made meaning through them, and there were deep consequences for not adhering to them. So watching this new group of people navigate their own way into belonging without these guide rails must have been destabilizing. And beyond that, these new community members likely craved something external themselves to signal their commitment to Christ and belonging in this community, just the same way we do. Eager to take their next steps in faith, grown men were wanting to be circumcised. People were willing to adopt new food practices to show their piety. They craved tangible markers of their new existence in Christ. And yet, regardless of these good intentions and motivations, relying on our own piety and ability to follow the rules just right results in products that are distorted and cramped. They're crumpled by the tightness in our fists and in our chests. Our works, the fruits, reflect that constriction. As Ruann read earlier, we're trying to get our own way, and that comes into repetitive, loveless, cheap sex, a stinking accumulation of mental and emotional garbage. Frenzied and joyless grabs for happiness, trinket gods, a magic show religion, paranoid loneliness, cutthroat competition, all-consuming and yet never satisfied wants, a brutal temper, an impotence to love or to be loved, divided homes and divided lives, small-minded and lopsided pursuits, the vicious habit of depersonalizing everyone into a rival, uncontrolled and uncontrollable addictions, and ugly parodies of community. We see in this vice list from Paul the tightness and tension that comes out of trying to do things our own way, the loneliness of self-reliance and self-righteousness, the emptiness of filling ourselves up with what doesn't satisfy. When we walk away from the vast, endless love of God, we are left with the brutal master of not enough and the meager provisions that we can scrape together. The leaky, drafty, propped up self-image that's based, unfortunately, on all that we lack. These vices or fruits of the flesh are a natural outpouring of a lack of hope, of grasping for significance, often at the expense of those around us. The result of forgetting about the love-filled grace has consequences that reach farther than just our internal psyches. Although, if that were all the damage it did, that would be enough. That it leaks into our relationships with those around us, with our relationships to systems of power, and with God who loves us so. In her book, Bird by Bird, Anne Lamott describes perfection in a way that sounds a lot like this. She says, perfectionism is the voice of the oppressor, it's the enemy of the people. It will keep you cramped and insane your whole life. She goes on to say, perfectionism is based on the obsessive belief that if you run carefully enough, hitting each stepping stone just right, you won't have to die. And the truth is that you will die anyway, and that a lot of people who aren't even looking at their feet are going to do a whole lot better and have a whole lot more fun than while they're doing it. In our efforts to limit our mistakes and avoid detection as a human person with faults and flaws, we miss out on the fullness of life that comes with freedom. But we all know that perfectionism is not the only thing keeping us hemmed in. Apathy and addiction, avoidance and selfishness, shame and judgment all do a fine job of keeping us from pursuing the freedom and wholeness that God's grace has to offer. We can keep our lives so full that there isn't a moment of stillness to notice God's presence. We can become so busy with the striving that we don't even recognize that we've lost sight of God's presence and God's love. So what's the answer then? If we're so attached to this pattern of being, how do we break free? Now, I want to be clear that I don't think that there is one singular way to do this or one answer to this issue of freedom. But in sitting with this question, I am drawn again into the radical practice of this call to sin boldly. But you see, that's not the full quote. And some of you already probably knew that. The fuller quote is, "Be sinners and sin boldly, but let your trust be bolder." If we are going to allow ourselves and those around us to be released from all that keeps us stuck, then trust is essential. Here, once again, Paul comes in to help. Through this letter, we have clues on how we can enact this freedom, and it is through love. Now, the word that's translated as through here in the Greek, it's a preposition and dia, which is such a flexible word, and I love it. It's usually translated as through, by, because of, or on account of. So it is on account of love, or because of love, or through love that we are made free. God, in God's own essence, is love itself, and so it is on account of that love that we are made free. Not on account of our own rule following, getting things just right, or even keeping everyone else in line. But it comes from the love that flows through us and from us and sets us free. And as a result, we are truly free indeed. So now that we're talking about love, I have more questions for you. What does love feel like? Think about a time when you felt completely loved, whether giving or receiving it. That belovedness blanketed the whole of your experience, that there was absolutely no denying the love that was present there. What does that feel like in your body? What thoughts do you have when you're in loving relationship? And how easy is it to notice God's presence when you're grounded in love? This love springs out of the freedom we receive, and in living in this love, we become even more free and can make space for others to be free as well. So as I was preparing this sermon, I asked my sister Jamie, who's in front, what she feels most free, and her answer actually surprised me. She said, "I feel most free to be myself sitting in your living room with Kelly, our older sister, and Mom. Even with the chaos of our kids being feral in the background, I know I can be myself. I can rant or I can be silly. I can share hard things and happy things, and I can know that I'm loved no matter what." It's in these loving relationships where we share honestly and vulnerably that we practice being free. And we all have our own relationships and groups that hold potential for this kind of sacred freedom. Could be your friends from Bible study or other parents on the PTA. Could be your knitting circle, or it could be your motorcycle club. It could be the text chain that you have with friends who never judge you. That's 50% deep, vulnerable sharing and 50% unhinged memes and jokes. It could, in fact, be anywhere. Depending on your place in life and in your relationships right now, the idea of cultivating that kind of loving and trusting relationship in your life might feel miles away. And if it does, I wonder if you might practice this kind of freedom with God, knowing that God can see all of who you are and loves you beyond measure. That even if your family or your friendships aren't in a place to show up for you in that way, that there is nothing that will stop God from showing up for you and loving you. When we are living in this kind of loving freedom, we are different. Our lives look different. We no longer have to compete and grasp for love or for belonging. Our self-image is based on our belonging to a God who not only loves us, but is love. And we hear about this difference again from where Rand read, much the same way that fruit appears in an orchard. Things like affection for others, exuberance about life, serenity. We develop a willingness to stick with things, a sense of compassion in the heart, and a conviction that a basic holiness permeates things and people. We find ourselves involved in loyal commitments, not needing to force our way in life, able to marshal and direct our energies wisely. And while the Message translation may not have the exact same words as the verses we might have memorized as kids, love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, and self-control, it's hard to remember if you don't sing them. These are also the fruits of the Spirit. They're written in a way we can hear and see them lived out. And these fruits demonstrate a life of flourishing. And this flourishing does not guarantee that you will have no struggles and your life will be easy. The early church struggled, and we do too. Yet in our freedom, in the midst of these struggles, these fruits of the Spirit emerge. So, no matter what your current struggles are, or the nature of your relationships, or how free you feel in this moment, God's grace is for you. It is on account of the love of God that God sees you and gently beckons you to step into freedom. Freedom from guilt and shame. Freedom from those tyrannical rules and lists of shoulds and don'ts. Freedom to sin boldly on account of love. And on account of love, may we find that our trust is bolder than our failings. Will you pray with me? God of freedom and love, help us to learn to love like you, to love you more deeply, to love those around us more deeply, and to love ourselves more deeply. May our trust in you be so bold that we freely share who you made us to be, your beloved children. Amen.